Hi there, and welcome to Coup English. In this series, we explore the lives of amazing people and help you improve your English at the same time. Ready? Let's dive in. Sigmund Freud, the mind's architect, a life shaping the depths of human thought. Chapter 1. A child of two worlds, early years in Moravia and Vienna. In the small Moravian town of Freiburg, now Pribor in the Czech Republic, Sigismund Freud was born on May 6, 1856, into a world that straddled tradition and transformation. His father, Jakob Freud, was a wool merchant, a man of fading fortunes but sharp intellect, who had already fathered two sons in a previous marriage. His third child, born to his much younger second wife, Amalia, would carry a name heavy with expectations and layered heritage. Sigmund, as he would later call himself, arrived into a Jewish family at a time when Jews were tolerated, but never quite embraced within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Freuds lived modestly, their economic circumstances made more uncertain by the rising tide of industrial capitalism, which reshaped the livelihoods of traditional tradesmen like Jacobi. Despite this, the home was rich in books, ideas, and languages. Freud grew up immersed in the sound of Yiddish, German, Hebrew, and Czech, a multilingual environment that mirrored the cultural complexity of the empire and planted early seeds of psychological observation. His mother, Amalia, was bright, strong-willed, and deeply devoted to her son. Sigmund was her firstborn and her favorite, a role he would never quite relinquish. She called him Mein Goldener Siggi, my golden Siggi, and her fierce admiration created in the boy both confidence and a deep sense of destiny. From an early age, he was marked as exceptional, not just by his mother, but by his teachers and family. When Sigmund was 4, the family left Freiburg for Vienna. It was a move prompted not by ambition, but necessity. Economic hardship had become too great to bear in the provinces, and Vienna promised stability, if not prosperity. The city was crowded, cosmopolitan, and politically restless, a melting pot of ideas and tensions, where nationalities rubbed shoulders and class divisions ran deep. For Freud, it would become both home and crucible. The family settled in the Leopoldstadt district, a working-class neighborhood with a large Jewish population. Their life was modest, even cramped, but inside their apartment, Freud found a different kind of wealth: intellectual stimulation. His father, though not formally educated, quoted the Bible, read philosophy, and told stories that lingered in Freud's mind. Amalia, too, possessed a remarkable memory and strong opinions, which she shared freely. These early domestic conversations, combining tradition and curiosity, helped shape young Freud's hunger for understanding. He was a solitary child, often lost in thought. He learned to read fluently by the age of 5 and quickly outpaced his peers. At school, he was often praised, but also watched with suspicion. He was different, too precocious, too serious. A teacher once remarked that young Freud seemed to think more than was good for a child his age, but he was not easily distracted. His notebooks were filled with observations, quotations, even dreams. Freud's intellectual appetite was voracious. He began learning Latin and Greek in his early teens and devoured classical literature, from Homer to Goethe. He also developed a fascination with language itself, the way words concealed and revealed meaning, the gap between what people said and what they meant. These early musings would later find form in his revolutionary theories. But behind this intellectual brilliance lay a boy often burdened by the adult world. The family's finances were unstable. He witnessed his father humiliated in the marketplace and occasionally mocked for his thick accent and old-fashioned manner. Sigmund admired Jacob, but also resented the limitations he represented, a man defeated by the new world. At times, he seemed to idolize strength, willpower, and clarity, qualities he later sought in the mind and the self. Perhaps most telling was an incident from Freud's childhood that he would later recount in his autobiographical writings. He remembered watching his father walking with him through the streets of Vienna when a non-Jewish man knocked Jacob's hat into the gutter. Jacob picked it up, brushed it off, and walked on without protest. Freud, only a boy, was stunned. Why had his father not stood up for himself? Why did he seem so passive? That image of strength subdued, of pride swallowed, would linger for decades. The move to Vienna, though born of hardship, opened doors that would otherwise have remained closed. Freud was admitted to the prestigious Leopoldstädter Communal Real Gymnasium, where he excelled in almost every subject. He studied with intensity, often late into the night, using a small oil lamp so as not to disturb his siblings. His ambition was quiet but relentless. There was no question that he would go to university. The question was, to do what? At first, he dreamed of becoming a lawyer, then considered politics. But it was reading the works of Goethe, and later Charles Darwin, that redirected his path. Darwin's theories, especially the concept of evolution and the unconscious instincts of animals, fascinated Freud. He saw in them a framework to explore not just the body, but the mind. By the time he finished high school, the foundations of his future were laid. A deep hunger to understand the unseen, a fascination with language and behavior, and a desire, perhaps even a need, to leave a mark on the world. Vienna had not only given Freud opportunity, it had given him purpose. The boy from Moravia, once cradled by a mother's fierce love and stirred by a father's quiet struggle, was now poised to enter the University of Vienna. His journey into the mind had begun not as a sudden revelation, but as a gradual unveiling, shaped by the currents of childhood, the echoes of a divided empire, and the unspoken questions that haunted him even then. Chapter 2. The Spark of Curiosity, Education, Mentors, and the Seeds of Psychoanalysis. At the age of 17, Sigmund Freud began his studies at the University of Vienna, enrolling in the Faculty of Medicine, though he would never practice as a conventional physician. His choice to enter the medical field was less a matter of passion for the body than of fascination with the mind. Even in these early university days, Freud was more interested in what lay beneath the surface, beneath skin, beneath behavior, beneath words. He was a serious, deliberate student. His peers, often preoccupied with gossip or student politics, saw him as intense, even aloof. Yet behind his focused exterior was a mind that absorbed knowledge rapidly and linked ideas in unexpected ways. He showed a keen interest in biology, particularly in the structure and function of the nervous system. Long hours were spent in the laboratory of Ernst Bruck, a respected physiologist who believed that all life processes, including mental activity, could be explained by physical laws. Bruck would become one of Freud's most important mentors, not only because of his scientific stature, but because he encouraged the young man to challenge conventional thinking. Under Bruck's supervision, Freud began research on the anatomy of the brain and spinal cord, publishing his first scientific papers before he even completed his medical degree. The experience shaped him in profound ways. He learned to value precision, patience, and rigor, but also to see that behind empirical data, there were always deeper questions waiting. Money remained a problem. To support himself, Freud worked as a tutor and translator. Fluent in several languages, including English, he translated works by John Stuart Mill and other thinkers. But even these side jobs fed his intellectual hunger. The writings of Mill, for instance, opened his mind to the complexities of human thought, liberty, and internal conflictual themes he would explore for the rest of his life. During this period, Freud also began attending lectures in philosophy, history, and literature. He found inspiration in the works of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche philosophers who dared to speak of desire, suffering, and the irrational elements of human existence. Though Freud rarely acknowledged their influence publicly, their ideas left traces in his evolving worldview. He was starting to believe that the mind could not be fully understood through biology alone. Something intangible, yet real, operated beneath awareness. But it wasn't until 1885, when Freud was awarded a research fellowship to study in Paris under Jean-Martin Charcot, that a decisive transformation occurred. Charcot, a towering figure in the field of neurology, was investigating hysteria condition dismissed by many as theatrical or fraudulent, especially when diagnosed in women. Charcot, however, treated it as a real and puzzling disorder, and used hypnosis to explore its roots. Freud was fascinated. He observed demonstrations in which women under hypnosis exhibited strange and powerful symptoms: paralysis, memory loss, emotional outbursts, all without any apparent physical cause. What struck Freud most was that these symptoms, so dramatic in expression, could vanish just as quickly under suggestion. What if, Freud wondered, the mind itself could produce illness? What if the body became a messenger for feelings too disturbing to be spoken? Charcot's lectures were electrifying. He presented the mind not as a calm and rational force, but as a battlefield of hidden energies and suppressed conflicts. For Freud, it was a revelation. He saw that the mind was not transparent to itself, that it had corners it could not illuminate on its own. It was here that the seeds of psychoanalysis were first sown, not yet in theory, but in feeling. Returning to Vienna in 1886, Freud brought back more than notebooks and new techniques. He returned with a mission. He opened a small private practice, applying what he had learned about hypnosis and hysteria to his own patients. Though some colleagues were skeptical, or even hostile, toward these methods, Freud pressed forward, guided more by instinct than approval. He had begun to sense that what was needed was not merely treatment, but listening. Deep, careful listening, not to the words patients spoke, but to what lay beneath them, the silences, the stutters, the dreams, the seemingly irrelevant details. This approach, which would later evolve into the talking cure, was not yet fully formed. Freud was still experimenting, still searching for the right method and language to capture what he was uncovering. But already, the outlines of a new path were emerging. He began keeping detailed case notes, not just on physical symptoms, but on his patients' inner lives. He paid attention to their childhood memories, their family dynamics, their secret thoughts. It was during this time that Freud met Joseph Breuer, an older physician who had been treating a young woman named Anna O, suffering from severe hysteria. Breuer had found that letting her talk without judgment or interruption gradually reduced her symptoms. Anna O herself called it the talking cure. This phrase would echo in Freud's mind for years. Though Breuer's interest in the case waned, Freud's only deepened. He saw in Anna O's case a door opening to a vast and uncharted territory, the unconscious. If trauma and desire could live in the mind without conscious access, if symptoms could be symbolic expressions of hidden pain, then a whole new model of mental life was needed. Still, Freud was not yet ready to announce a new science. He remained cautious, writing scholarly articles and continuing his clinical work. But inside him, something had shifted permanently. He no longer saw the mind as a clean, logical machine. It was a layered, conflicted realm, a house with many rooms, most of them locked. By the end of this chapter in his life, Freud had taken his first steps into what would become psychoanalysis. He was still largely unknown outside academic circles, still financially insecure, still grappling with but the course was set. From biology to the unconscious, from laboratory to clinic, Freud's journey had begun to follow a deeper current, one that would pull him further and further from convention and deeper into the mind's most mysterious depths. Chapter 3: A Mind in Formation, Medical School, and the Allure of the Brain. When Freud enrolled in the University of Vienna's medical school in 1873, it was not with a desire to become a physician in the traditional sense. His motivation was more philosophical than practical. What intrigued him was not merely the body's structure or pathology, but the vast unknowns of human consciousness. Medicine, to him, was a pathway, not an end. In those early years, Freud often felt like an outsider. While many of his classmates were focused on finishing quickly and beginning profitable careers, he took his time. His studies extended over 8 years, much longer than usual, not because of lack of ability, but due to his detours into research and his hunger for deeper understanding. His professors noticed he wasn't merely absorbing facts, he was questioning them. He wanted to know not just how things worked, but why. He gravitated toward the field of neuroanatomy, the intricate study of the brain and nervous system. In this, he found a subject that seemed to mirror his own mental landscape, complex, mysterious, layered. Under the guidance of Ernst Bruck, his mentor from the previous chapter, Freud immersed himself in microscopic studies. He dissected frogs, studied eels, and examined nerve tissue with painstaking care. Every cell, every fiber became a puzzle. These years taught him precision and discipline. They also taught him humility. The brain, even seen under the sharpest lenses of 19th century microscopes, remained largely unfathomable. In 1877, Freud published a paper on the spinal cord of a fish, an impressive piece of work for someone still in training. It showed his capacity for original thought and rigorous analysis. But the field he was entering was conservative and slow-moving. The questions Freud wanted to ask about dreams, desire, trauma had no place in the anatomical laboratories of the time. Still, he continued to build a solid scientific foundation. He developed an early interest in the effects of cocaine, publishing a paper in 1884 advocating its use as an anesthetic and mood enhancer. This would later become a point of controversy, as Freud underestimated its addictive potential. But at the time, his study was seen as cutting-edge. It showed a young scholar willing to explore uncharted terrain even when it was uncomfortable. Outside of school, Freud's personal life began to take shape. He met Martha Bernays in 1882, a young woman from a respected Jewish family. They fell in love quickly, but financial instability prevented an immediate marriage. For 4 years, they corresponded passionately by letter, hundreds of them, while Freud worked long hours trying to establish his career. These letters reveal a more emotional, even vulnerable Freud, wrestling with ambition, jealousy, hope, and insecurity. The emotional complexity of this relationship, with its highs and lows, its longing and restraint, would later influence his thinking on love, repression, and intimacy. The tension between Freud's scientific training and his personal curiosity continued to grow. He was drawn to questions of memory, dreams, and personality, topics considered speculative, even unserious, by most of his colleagues. But Freud saw something others didn't, that mental suffering was real, and that the human mind, with all its contradictions and hidden depths, was the most urgent subject of study. Vienna in the late 19th century was both a blessing and a challenge for an intellectual like Freud. On the one hand, it was a city of music, literature, and progressive thought. On the other, it was burdened by deep social conservatism, growing anti-Semitism, and a rigid academic hierarchy. Freud had to fight not only for ideas, but for recognition. As a Jew without wealth or political connection, his path upward would never be smooth. In 1881, Freud finally received his medical degree, but instead of entering clinical practice full-time, he remained close to the academic world. He continued his research at the Vienna General Hospital, focusing on brain anatomy and nervous disorders. This was the period when he deepened his understanding of hysteria, aphasia, and the emerging theories about how brain injuries could affect personality and behavior. For Freud, these cases were not just medical curiosities, they were clues. They suggested that the mind had its own architecture, its own system of rules and disruptions. Slowly, a realization began to form. Not all suffering could be explained by damaged tissue or nervous lesions. Some suffering came from within, unseen, unmeasured, yet intensely real. And if the mind could produce such suffering, might it also be capable of healing itself under the right conditions? These were bold thoughts for a young doctor, but Freud did not voice them openly, not yet. He was still collecting evidence, still shaping the language he would one day use. But the questions were already burning in him. Why do people repeat harmful patterns? Why do they forget painful memories? Why do dreams disturb us so deeply? At this stage, Freud was not yet the father of psychoanalysis. He was a medical researcher with an uneasy feeling that something important was being overlooked by science. He was fascinated by what science could not explain, by the gaps, the absences, the silences, and rather than ignoring them, he began to lean in. Looking back, these years represent a quiet revolution in Freud's life. No grand theories yet, no fame or controversy, but his vision was sharpening. He was beginning to see the human mind as a site of conflict and mystery, not just logic and biology. He didn't yet know how to map it, but he knew it was there. Freud, the scientist, had become Freud, the explorer, not of the outer world, but of the inner one. Chapter 4. Journeys within and without, travels, marriage, and early work. By the mid-1880s, Sigmund Freud had completed his formal education, earned his medical license, and begun to envision the shape of his professional life. Yet, the years ahead would be less about achievement and more about transformation. These were the years of exploration, not only in scientific terms, but emotional and personal as well. They were years in which Freud stepped into the world, quite literally, and returned with ideas that would change it. His 1885 fellowship to study in Paris under Jean-Martin Charcot marked the first time. Freud had left the German-speaking world. Paris was unlike anything he had known. Modern, chaotic, brilliant, he was captivated not only by the city's art, fashion, and political dynamism, but by the intellectual freedom that moved through its lecture halls. Charcot's work on hysteria, especially his public demonstrations of hypnosis, was radical. In Vienna, hysteria was still treated as a feminine weakness or a social performance. In Paris, Freud saw it examined with seriousness, precision, and, most importantly, respect. He watched as patients who had suffered for years suddenly transformed under the guidance of a confident voice and a subtle suggestion. These experiences shook him. What if the mind could be treated not with scalpels and syringes, but with attention and understanding? Charcot also introduced Freud to the idea that psychological disorders could be traced to hidden causes, not always organic, but embedded in memory, trauma, and repression. Though Charcot himself was a neurologist, not a psychologist, he planted a seed that would later grow into Freud's own radical belief that we are not fully aware of what drives us. After several months in Paris, Freud returned to Vienna, changed, energized, but also aware of the professional risks he now faced. The medical establishment in Vienna was conservative, skeptical of hypnosis, and resistant to psychological explanations for physical symptoms. Nevertheless, Freud opened a private practice, focusing primarily on nervous disorders, and began applying what he had seen in Paris. He also began experimenting more with hypnosis, attempting to access patients' repressed memories through suggestion and verbal probing. At the same time, his personal life took a decisive step forward. In 1886, after 4 years of long-distance courtship, he married Martha Bernays. Their engagement had been prolonged by Freud's financial instability, but finally, the young doctor felt confident enough to start a family. Their wedding marked not only the union of two individuals, but a critical emotional grounding in Freud's life. In Martha, he found devotion, structure, and emotional steadiness. She gave him a sense of order that allowed him to focus on the stormier landscapes of the human psyche. They settled into a modest apartment in Vienna, and over the next decade, they would have 6 children. Freud was, by all accounts, a devoted, if occasionally distant father. He worked long hours, often retreating into his study until late at night. But his letters to Martha remained warm and full of yearning. Despite his growing professional ambition, he seemed to crave the simplicity and safety of domestic life, a striking contrast to the mental chaos he explored through his patients. It was during these early years of marriage and practice that Freud began collaborating with Joseph Breuer, a respected Viennese physician and an early influence on his thinking. Breuer introduced Freud to the case of Anna O, a young woman suffering from hysteria. What fascinated Freud was not just the symptoms, paralysis, hallucinations, language loss, but the fact that talking about her past seemed to bring relief. This so-called talking cure would become the basis for Freud's eventual development of psychoanalysis. With Breuer, he co-authored studies on hysteria in 1895, a work that introduced the idea that psychological symptoms could be expressions of unconscious conflict. It marked a shift from physical explanations to symbolic ones. Symptoms, Freud believed, were not meaningless. They were messages, coded in suffering, from the unconscious mind. Freud's early clinical work reflected this transition. He began keeping meticulous notes on his patients, not just tracking their symptoms, but analyzing their speech patterns, their dreams, their childhood memories. He started to observe recurring themes: guilt, repression, unresolved family dynamics. He noticed how patients avoided certain topics, how they circled around pain without confronting it, and he began to suspect that repression, pushing unwanted thoughts out of conscious awareness, was not just a psychological defense, but a fundamental human mechanism. The techniques he was using, hypnosis, free association, dream analysis, were still in flux. He was experimenting, discarding, refining, but behind the clinical work was something more personal. Freud was also trying to understand himself. He often interpreted his own dreams, kept detailed self-reflections, and wrestled with the emotional toll of his patients' stories. He was not yet a global thinker or a man of controversy. He was still a physician, listening closely, probing gently, trying to hear what had not been said. These years were a turning point. Freud was no longer just a medical doctor or laboratory scientist. He had entered a new space, a place where the scientific and the human merged. He was slowly crafting a new language for inner life, one shaped by memory, conflict, desire, and resistance. And though few in Vienna noticed, the foundations of psychoanalysis had been quietly laid in a small apartment filled with children, books, and the quiet murmur of patients telling their truths. Chapter 5. Beyond the Surface: Hypnosis, Hysteria, and the Birth of New Ideas. By the early 1890s, Freud found himself caught between two worlds: the medical tradition he had been trained in, and the growing belief that the human mind could not be fully understood through physiology alone. His work with patients suffering from hysteria was changing him, not only in how he practiced medicine, but in how he understood the mind itself. At first, Freud relied heavily on hypnosis, a method he had learned from Charcot and seen refined by Joseph Breuer. Under hypnosis, patients sometimes recalled traumatic events they had long forgotten, events that seemed to lie at the heart of their mysterious symptoms. A woman's paralysis, for instance, might be linked to the loss of a child, a man's blindness to a moment of unbearable shame. These connections, once brought into awareness, often brought immediate relief. But Freud was never fully satisfied with hypnosis. Some patients could not be hypnotized at all. Others resisted the process or became too suggestible. Most of all, the insights gained under hypnosis often seemed fleeting, forgotten again after a few days or weeks. Freud began to wonder whether accessing the unconscious required something more natural, more sustainable. In response, he began to develop what he called free association, a method where the patient was encouraged to speak freely without censorship or judgment about whatever came to mind. At first, this approach seemed chaotic. Patients talked about dreams, memories, images, fragments of thought. But Freud noticed patterns, slips of the tongue which he would later call Fehlerstunken, or Freudian slips, recurring symbols, hesitations. They all hinted at deeper truths struggling to surface. He found that patients often resisted certain topics. They would fall silent, change the subject, grow irritated, or laugh nervously. Freud came to believe that this resistance was itself meaningful. The unconscious, he theorized, was not simply a forgotten part of the mind. It was actively repressed. Painful memories, unacceptable desires, disturbing thoughts, they were pushed down, hidden away, not because they were forgotten, but because they were too threatening to face. Freud's thinking began to evolve rapidly. He no longer saw symptoms as just responses to trauma, but as compromises, symbolic expressions of inner conflict. A hysterical paralysis, for instance, might represent both a desire and a fear, a wish to withdraw from life and a punishment for that wish. This duality fascinated him. The unconscious, he realized, was not a passive storehouse, but a dynamic realm, a battleground of opposing forces. In Studies on Hysteria 1895, co-authored with Breuer, Freud began articulating these ideas in public. The book presented a series of case studies, including Anna O, and introduced the concept that emotional suffering could produce physical symptoms, and that these symptoms could be resolved by uncovering the underlying emotional truth. The work marked a break from conventional medicine and, eventually, a break from Breuer himself. Breuer, though intellectually generous, was cautious. He became uncomfortable with Freud's growing emphasis on sexuality as a driving force in mental life. Freud, for his part, was becoming convinced that childhood experiences, particularly those involving desire, shame, and family dynamics, played a central role in neurosis. The final split came after Freud proposed that repressed sexual memories were the root of hysteria, a theory Breuer found too speculative, even dangerous. Isolated from many of his peers, Freud pressed on alone. He began to work more deeply with individual patients, often spending hours each day in his quiet Vienna office, listening, observing, interpreting. He abandoned hypnosis altogether and refined his method of free association, encouraging patients to lie on a couch, away from his gaze, to speak more freely. The setting became iconic. The patient on the couch, the analyst just out of sight, silently attentive. At the same time, Freud was also analyzing himself. He believed that no one could guide others into the unconscious without first exploring their own. He began interpreting his own dreams, his memories, even his childhood experiences. This process led to one of his most important and controversial works, The Interpretation of Dreams, published in 1900. Though largely developed during this period. In this book, Freud proposed that dreams were not random, meaningless experiences, but structured expressions of the unconscious. They disguised wishes, fears, and conflicts, usually through metaphor, displacement, and symbolic language. He called this process the dream work. Dreams, he argued, allowed the unconscious to express itself in a disguised form, bypassing the censorship of waking consciousness. One of the central ideas in this theory was the Oedipus complex, the notion that young children experience unconscious desire for the opposite sex parent and rivalry with the same-sex parent. Drawing on his own childhood reflections, Freud saw this as a universal stage in psychological development. The theory was shocking and even now remains controversial, but it laid the foundation for Freud's understanding of human desire, guilt, and repression. Despite the radical nature of his ideas, Freud continued to write with scientific rigor. He sought evidence in language, behavior, and dream patterns. He believed that the unconscious could be studied systematically, carefully, as a science. Yet the language he used was literary, even poetic at times. He was constructing not only a theory of mind, but a new way of speaking about human experience. Freud was now truly alone in his intellectual journey. His early support from Breuer was gone. His work was dismissed by most of the Viennese medical community, but he did not retreat. Instead, he wrote more, studied harder, and continued his clinical practice. Every patient, every case, every night of troubled sleep was another data point in his growing map of the mind. He was no longer simply a doctor. He was something new, a psychological cartographer, sketching the contours of a hidden world. And although few were listening yet, Freud's voice, quiet, persistent, and radically original, had begun to shape the language of the 20th century. Chapter 6. The Interpretation of Dreams, Unveiling the Unconscious. As the 19th century drew to a close, Sigmund Freud began to work on what he would later call his most important and personal book, The Interpretation of Dreams, Die Traumdeutung. This was not merely a theoretical exercise, it was a labor of introspection, a confrontation with his own mind, and a quiet declaration of intellectual independence. The book would become a cornerstone of modern psychology, but when he began writing it in the mid-1890s, few understood the significance of what he was attempting. At the heart of Freud's work was a radical premise that dreams are not nonsense, nor are they divine messages. They are meaningful expressions of unconscious desires. They are coded messages from within, crafted by the mind's most secret forces. He called dreams the royal road to the unconscious, a phrase that would become iconic, but at the time, this idea was far from accepted. To many in the scientific world, dreams were too elusive, too subjective, to be taken seriously. Yet Freud approached the topic with both scientific rigor and personal passion. In fact, the interpretation of dreams was filled with analyses of his own dreams. He examined them not as mystical riddles, but as psychological puzzles. One dream in particular, the now famous Irma injection dream, became the foundation for much of his early theory. In this dream, Freud tried to diagnose a patient named Irma, and a series of strange events and distorted images followed. Upon analysis, Freud realized the dream reflected his own anxieties about professional failure, responsibility, and guilt. It wasn't about Irma, it was about him. This insight led him to develop two core principles of dream analysis: manifest content and latent content. The manifest content is the dream as we remember it, its images, narrative, and sensations. The latent content, however, is the hidden psychological meaning behind those images, often rooted in unconscious wishes, fears, or conflicts. According to Freud, dreams disguise their true meanings through a process he called the dream work, which includes mechanisms such as condensation, compressing multiple ideas into one image, displacement, shifting emotional intensity from one idea to another, and symbolization. These concepts provided a framework not only for understanding dreams, but also for understanding the unconscious mind itself. Freud argued that many psychological symptoms operated in the same way, symbolizing deeper truths that were difficult or dangerous to confront directly. The dream, like the symptom, was a compromise between desire and defense. Writing the book was both exhausting and liberating. Freud worked mostly in solitude, revising again and again, sometimes through the quiet of night while his wife and children slept. His household was growing by now. He had several children to support, and financial pressure was a constant concern. The medical community remained skeptical, if not openly dismissive, of his ideas. Yet he pressed on, increasingly convinced that he was uncovering something essential about the human condition. In 1899, Freud completed the manuscript. The book was published in November of that year, but the cover bore the date 1900, perhaps a symbolic gesture, as if Freud wanted his great work to open a new century. Yet, despite the boldness of its ideas, the book received little attention at first. Sales were slow, reviews were scarce, and Freud's name remained largely unknown outside a small circle of like-minded thinkers. But Freud was not discouraged. For him, the interpretation of dreams marked a turning point, not just in his career, but in his identity. He was no longer simply a doctor or researcher. He had become a theorist of the mind, a founder of a new discipline. He believed that understanding dreams could help us understand not only individual suffering but human nature itself. Meanwhile, Freud continued to explore his own unconscious. He subjected himself to a process of self-analysis that lasted several years, using his dreams, childhood memories, slips of the tongue, and associations to trace the origins of his own conflicts. This journey into his past was not always pleasant. He uncovered painful emotions, loss, rivalry, desire, and came to understand how deeply childhood experiences shaped adult life. His father's death in 1896, which had affected him more than he admitted publicly, became a focal point of his reflections. In Mourning, Freud confronted unresolved tensions between admiration, fear, and rebellion. The insights gained through self-analysis gave Freud the confidence to apply his theories more broadly. He began to see common patterns in patients' dreams: fear of castration, unresolved Oedipal tensions, the reappearance of early memories in symbolic form. These patterns led him to develop his now famous theory of psychosexual development, though its full expression would come later. In this period, Freud also began to attract the attention of a small number of followers. Among the first was Wilhelm Steckel, a former patient who became a collaborator. Later, others like Alfred Adler and Carl Jung would join his growing circle. But at this stage, Freud was still a solitary voice, articulating ideas that many found strange, even disturbing. Still, his commitment never wavered. He believed that by decoding the language of dreams, he was offering humanity a mirror, one that reflected not the idealized self we presented to the world, but the conflicted, desiring, and often tormented self beneath. To him, the unconscious was not a place of madness, it was the hidden engine of thought, creativity, and emotion. Looking back, the interpretation of dreams was more than a book. It was a manifesto for a new way of thinking, a call to look inward, to face what is hidden, and to listen, truly listen, to the strange and symbolic messages our minds send us each night. Though few recognized its brilliance at the time, the world would catch up. Slowly, Freud's vision of the unconscious would become one of the most influential ideas of the modern era. And it all began, as Freud would later say, with the analysis of a dream. Chapter 7. Fame and Fire. Friends, Rivals, and the Psychoanalytic Movement. By the early 1900s, Sigmund Freud's theories had begun to attract attention beyond Vienna, sparking both admiration and controversy. After years of professional isolation, he was no longer working entirely alone. A circle was forming around him, one that would become both the foundation and the battleground of the psychoanalytic movement. The publication of the interpretation of dreams had not brought instant fame, but it slowly drew the interest of thinkers dissatisfied with traditional psychology and medicine. Freud's ideas resonated with a new generation of scholars and physicians who were intrigued by the mind's hidden depths and the possibility of healing through words. Among the earliest of these was Wilhelm Stekel, a Viennese physician with a poetic sensibility, and Alfred Adler, whose sharp intellect and social concerns would later lead him down his own path. But the most promising, and perhaps most fateful addition to Freud's circle was Carl Gustav Jung, a brilliant Swiss psychiatrist working at the Berg-Holzli Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich. Jung was young, charismatic, and already experimenting with word association tests and theories of the unconscious. When he read Freud's work, he saw in it a new language for understanding the psyche. Freud, in turn, saw Jung as the heir to his ideas, a possible successor who could extend psychoanalysis beyond its Jewish origins and into the wider European intellectual mainstream. Their correspondence began in 1906 and quickly deepened. They exchanged letters filled with excitement, reflection, and philosophical speculation. When they finally met in person the following year, they reportedly spoke for 13 hours straight. Freud believed he had found not just a colleague, but a spiritual son. The affection was real, but so were the tensions, hidden at first, but destined to erupt. As the movement grew, Freud formalized it. In 1902, he began hosting weekly meetings in his Vienna apartment. These gatherings, known as the Wednesday Psychological Society, brought together doctors, scholars, and thinkers interested in psychoanalysis. The meetings were informal but intense, filled with animated debates and theoretical proposals. Over time, they grew into the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society. To Freud, these meetings were more than academic exercises. They were acts of resistance against the medical establishment, against religious conservatism, against the belief that the human mind could be understood purely through biology. He was building a new intellectual world, one based on the belief that the unconscious was real, that childhood mattered, and that human beings were driven by powerful, often conflicting desires. But with growth came growing pains. As more followers joined, disagreements emerged. Some members questioned Freud's emphasis on sexuality. Others wanted to bring in social, cultural, or spiritual perspectives. Freud, however, remained steadfast. He believed that the libido, the sexual energy of the psyche, was central to understanding neurosis. To him, this was not an obsession, but a recognition of psychological truth. Repression of desire, especially in early life, caused psychic conflict. This insistence began to alienate some of his followers. Alfred Adler, once close to Freud, began developing his own theory of individual psychology, which emphasized feelings of inferiority and the drive for power rather than sexuality. Freud saw Adler's departure as betrayal, though he tried to mask his disappointment with a cool academic tone. The split with Carl Jung, however, would cut much deeper. At first, Freud and Jung were seen as a powerful intellectual pair. Freud, the elder theorist, Jung, the young visionary. Together, they attended conferences, published papers, and expanded psychoanalysis across Europe. In 1910, the International Psychoanalytic Association was founded, with Jung as its first president. Freud hoped Jung would help psychoanalysis gain respectability in Protestant and non-Jewish circles. But beneath the surface, serious rifts had formed. Jung was increasingly uncomfortable with Freud's sexual theory. He admired Freud's work, but believed the psyche was more than libido. He was drawn to myth, religion, archetypes, and the collective unconscious, a realm Freud rejected as mystical and unscientific. Freud, in turn, viewed Jung's ideas as a dilution of his theory and a step away from empirical rigor. Their relationship deteriorated slowly but painfully. Letters became cold, meetings tense. In 1914, Jung officially broke with Freud, resigning from the Psychoanalytic Association. Freud, deeply hurt, never forgave him. The rupture was personal, intellectual, and symbolic. It marked the end of Freud's dream of a unified psychoanalytic movement and the beginning of a series of splits that would continue for decades. Despite these tensions, Freud's influence continued to grow. His writings, 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, 1905, Totem and Taboo, 1913, and the Psychopathology of Everyday Life, 1901, were gaining international readership. His ideas on repression, resistance, and the unconscious were slowly entering academic discussions, literary circles, and even the public imagination. But fame brought its own challenges. Freud became the target of criticism, caricature, and even hostility. His emphasis on childhood sexuality was seen by many as indecent, even dangerous. Newspapers mocked him. Some medical journals dismissed him outright. He was accused of reducing the human soul to a set of base impulses. Freud remained largely unfazed. He once said that being attacked was preferable to being ignored. For him, criticism was a sign that his ideas had entered public consciousness, that they mattered. He continued to work, write, teach, and refine his theories. Even as allies fell away, new ones emerged. He began mentoring younger analysts, including Otto Rank, Sander Ferenczi, and his own daughter, Anna Freud, who would later become a major figure in child psychoanalysis. The psychoanalytic movement had been born in a modest Viennese apartment, nurtured by a circle of restless minds. It had now grown into an international network marked by brilliance and conflict in equal measure. Freud had gained what he long sought, recognition, but it had come at a price. Friendships broken, alliances shattered, and a movement that bore his name, but not always his vision. Still, Freud pressed forward. The fire of inquiry that had lit his youth continued to burn. He believed he had touched something fundamental in the human experience, and he would not stop until it was fully revealed. Chapter 8. Conflict and Legacy. Schisms, Revisions, and Freud's Evolving Theories. By the time Freud reached his mid-50s, psychoanalysis had become more than an idea. It was a movement, a doctrine, and increasingly, a battlefield. What had begun as a solitary exploration of the human unconscious had now attracted a global audience. However, with visibility came complexity. Diverging interpretations, professional jealousies, and theoretical disagreements threatened the cohesion of the field. Freud found himself at the center of it all, respected yet embattled. After his split with Jung in 1914, Freud began refining his theories further. He was no longer content with only discussing the structure of dreams or the role of childhood sexuality. He sought to build a complete model of the human psyche, one that accounted not just for desire, but for conflict, trauma, and the psychological mechanisms of defense. These years were intellectually rich, but also emotionally draining. Freud had lost trusted collaborators and now found himself facing the responsibility of defining and defending psychoanalysis almost single-handedly. One of his most important contributions during this time was the theory of the id, ego, and superego, a tripartite model of the mind introduced in the 1920s. The ID represented primitive drives and instincts, the ego, the rational mediator, and the superego, the internalized moral authority. This model offered a more structured and dynamic view of how internal conflicts shape behavior. It replaced the earlier division between the conscious and unconscious, with a more nuanced understanding of psychological life. The First World War had a profound impact on Freud. Not only did it destabilize Europe, but it also exposed new forms of trauma that traditional medicine could not explain. Soldiers returned from the front lines with symptoms of what was then called shell shock and is now understood as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Freud saw in this a validation of his theory. The mind could fracture under stress, with hidden memories and emotions re-emerging in disturbing ways. These cases reinforced his ideas about repression and the return of the repressed. During the post-war years, Freud's influence expanded outside of medicine. Writers, artists, and intellectuals began to draw inspiration from his ideas. Surrealist painters explored dream imagery and unconscious symbolism. Novelists created characters rich with psychological depth. Freud's concepts of the Oedipus complex, defense mechanisms, and unconscious desires became part of the cultural vocabulary. Yet, even as his ideas spread, Freud worried about dilution. He feared that psychoanalysis, once a rigorous clinical method, might become a vague, fashionable ideology. Internally, the psychoanalytic community continued to fracture. The 1920s saw new disagreements over technique, especially the role of the analyst in treatment. Some, like Ferenczi, advocated for a more active and emotionally responsive approach. Freud, though empathetic, emphasized neutrality and the importance of free association. He believed the analyst should act as a mirror, not a guide. Perhaps the most painful conflict of this period was not with a rival, but with his own body. In 1923, Freud discovered a lesion on his palate. It was cancer. Years of cigar smoking had taken their toll. Over the next 16 years, he would undergo more than 30 operations. The treatments were grueling, and speaking became increasingly painful, yet he refused to stop working. With a prosthetic device in his mouth and constant discomfort, he continued to write, teach, and see patients. Despite his physical suffering, Freud remained mentally sharp. He published one of his most important late works, Civilization and Its Discontents, 1930, in which he examined the tension between individual instinct and social order. He argued that the very things that made civilization possible, laws, norms, institutions, also suppressed the natural desires of individuals, creating a sense of perpetual discontent. It was a dark, brilliant reflection on the cost of progress. As his theories matured, Freud also began revising some earlier ideas. He acknowledged that aggression, not just sexuality, was a fundamental human drive. This led him to propose the concept of the death drive thanatos, a counterforce to the life instincts eros. He believed that human beings were not only driven to create, love, and connect, but also to destroy, dominate, and return to an inorganic state. It was a controversial and somber addition to his theory, but one Freud believed was necessary to explain war, repetition, and self-sabotage. Even as criticism of Freud increased, so too did his reputation. He received honors from universities and institutions across Europe and America. Analysts trained by Freud began to establish psychoanalytic centers in Berlin, London, and New York. His ideas were being taught, debated, and contested in languages he did not speak, in cities he would never visit. Freud had become more than a physician or theorist. He was a symbol of introspection, of courage, of the belief that knowledge of the self could bring liberation. But he knew that psychoanalysis was still a fragile project. "We are only at the beginning," he wrote to a colleague, "and already the roads are splitting." Freud accepted that his followers would adapt and change his ideas. What mattered to him was not orthodoxy, but honesty, a commitment to exploring the unconscious, however uncomfortable the truths might be. By the end of the 1920s, Freud had reshaped the intellectual landscape of the 20th century. Yet, the world around him was darkening. Political unrest, anti-Semitism, and the rise of authoritarianism casts a long shadow over Europe. Freud, a man who had spent his life investigating the inner struggles of individuals, was about to confront the collective madness of a continent on the brink of disaster. And through it all, he continued to write, to reflect, and to shape the discipline that bore his name, a discipline that, like its founder, refused to look away from what others feared to see. Chapter 9: Darkness and Determination, War, Illness, and Final Contributions. As Europe descended into political chaos in the 1930s, Freud found himself increasingly vulnerable, not just as an intellectual, but as a Jew. The rise of Nazism in Germany sent tremors through Vienna's intellectual circles. Jewish thinkers, artists, and physicians were being harassed, silenced, or worse. Freud, whose name was known across the world, was not immune. Though he rarely spoke publicly about politics, he had long warned about humanity's darker instincts. Now, those warnings were materializing. The Nazi annexation of Austria in 1938 was a turning point. The Freud family home was raided by the Gestapo. His daughter Anna, herself a practicing psychoanalyst, was briefly detained. Freud had resisted leaving Vienna, his city, his life's stage, but the danger had become undeniable. With the help of influential friends, including Marie Bonaparte and Ernest Jones, Freud obtained the necessary papers and financial guarantees to escape. He was 82 years old when he and much of his family fled to London. In exile, Freud's health rapidly deteriorated. The cancer in his jaw had worsened, and each conversation, each meal, became a test of endurance. He wore an obturator, a painful dental prosthesis that allowed him to speak, though often with difficulty. Yet he continued to work, editing, revising, and thinking. His last book, Moses and Monotheism, was completed during these final months. It was a controversial and deeply personal exploration of religious identity, historical memory, and the origins of moral law. Freud provocatively argued that Moses was not Hebrew by birth and suggested that monotheism originated in Egypt. These ideas were not just scholarly conjecture. They reflected Freud's own struggle with Jewish identity in a world that had turned hostile. London offered safety, but not peace. Freud was grateful to be free from Nazi terror, but he missed Vienna deeply. His study in the new home on Maresfield Gardens was carefully arranged to mirror the one he had left behind. His beloved collection of antiquities surrounded him, each piece representing a culture, a time, or a dream of continuity. These artifacts, like his theories, connected the ancient with the modern, the hidden with the seen. Despite his suffering, Freud remained intellectually engaged. He held court with visiting scholars and analysts, receiving them from his armchair, his faithful chow dog Jofi often resting at his feet. Conversations were slower now, more deliberate, but still sharp. There was no bitterness in his tone, only an enduring fascination with the human psyche. He had become something of a legend, an old sage whose ideas had reshaped not only psychology, but literature, art, and philosophy. And yet, he never considered his work complete. He still saw psychoanalysis as a beginning, a flashlight probing into the vast cave of the mind. He believed more discoveries were to come, perhaps by others, perhaps by those who would question him. In September 1939, as World War II broke out, Freud's pain became unbearable. He had made a pact with his physician, Max Schur, that when the suffering outweighed the will to live, he would be helped to die with dignity. That moment had come. Freud requested morphine, and over several days, he slipped into a final sleep. He died on September 23, 1939, surrounded by his daughter Anna and close companions. The timing was symbolic. As Europe tore itself apart, the man who had spent his life studying inner conflict passed away. He had once said that psychoanalysis was the third blow to human narcissism, after Copernicus and Darwin. He too had shown that man was not master of his own house. Now, the house of Europe itself was in flames. Freud's funeral was simple, attended by a few colleagues and admirers. His ashes were placed in a Grecian urn, given to him by Marie Bonaparte, which he had long treasured. It rests today in London's Golders Green Crematorium. But Freud did not die with his body. His ideas, sometimes misunderstood, often debated, always provocative, lived on. Psychoanalysis would evolve, split, and adapt. But its central claim, that to understand ourselves, we must look inward, bravely and honestly, remains one of the most powerful propositions of modern thought. Freud's late years were marked not just by illness and exile, but by extraordinary resilience. He faced dictatorship with clarity, disease with dignity, and death with calm. To the very end, he held to the belief that knowledge of the self, though painful, was essential to human freedom. In that belief, he left behind not only a discipline, but a legacy of courage, inquiry, and relentless honesty. Chapter 10. Death and Echoes: The Passing of a Mind and His Enduring Influence. Freud's passing in 1939 marked the end of a life shaped by relentless inquiry and layered complexities. But in many ways, it was only the beginning of his cultural and intellectual afterlife. As World War II raged on, Freud's psychoanalytic circle dispersed across continents. Many of his students and followers had already fled the growing shadows in Europe, and were now planting seeds of psychoanalysis in new soils: New York, London, Buenos Aires, and beyond. In these far-flung places, psychoanalysis took on different forms. In America, the Freudian tradition was embraced with a mixture of awe and adaptation. Freud's emphasis on the unconscious, repression, and the influence of childhood found a receptive audience. But American practitioners often softened his more unsettling conclusions. Psychoanalysis became domesticated, focused more on adjustment and well-being than on unmasking deep inner conflicts. Still, the essential Freudian vocabulary ID, ego, superego, defense mechanisms, Oedipus complex, entered public discourse and became part of the language of self-understanding. In Europe, psychoanalysis faced greater challenges. In post-war Vienna, it took time for Freud's name to be reclaimed from the ashes of Nazi occupation. But eventually, his image was restored and celebrated. His home at Burgos, 19, transformed into a museum of remembrance. In Paris, Rome, and Berlin, thinkers engaged critically with Freud's legacy, building bridges between psychoanalysis, philosophy, and the emerging fields of structuralism and postmodernism. Freud's influence was not confined to psychology. He transformed literature, inspiring novelists like Thomas Mann, Virginia Woolf, and Franz Kafka. He provided a new lens through which to view human motives, character development, and emotional subtext. Artists like Salvador Dali and the Surrealists took Freud's ideas about dreams and the unconscious and turned them into visual language. Philosophers such as Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida wrestled with his theories, sometimes critiquing them, other times extending them into new conceptual territories. In the decades following his death, Freud was both canonized and criticized. Feminist thinkers like Simone de Beauvoir and later Julia Kristeva and Luce Irigaray took issue with the patriarchal assumptions in his work, while also acknowledging the revolutionary power of his method. Some called psychoanalysis a science, others called it a myth. But whether revered or contested, Freud was never ignored. His daughter, Anna Freud, played a pivotal role in defending and developing his legacy. She became a major figure in child psychoanalysis, emphasizing the importance of the ego and adapting her father's ideas to educational and therapeutic contexts. Through her work and leadership, the Freud name continued to resonate within academic and clinical communities. As the 20th century unfolded, new psychological schools arose. Behaviorism, humanistic psychology, cognitive science, all offering different ways of understanding the mind. Freud's influence waned in some areas, but his foundational questions remained. What shapes our desires? Why do we repeat patterns of pain? What does it mean to be civilized, to be conscious, to be human? These questions continue to bear his imprint. Today, more than 8 decades after his death, Freud remains a towering figure. His theories are no longer accepted uncritically, but neither have they faded into obscurity. Instead, they live on in conversation, with new disciplines, new generations, and new interpretations. Psychoanalysis has evolved, fractured, hybridized, but its origin story remains Freud's story. Perhaps most importantly, Freud's legacy is not simply a set of theories, but a way of seeing. He taught the world that beneath the surface of our thoughts and actions lies a complex web of memory, emotion, and unconscious conflict. That understanding the self is not a luxury, but a necessity. That human behavior is rarely simple and never fully transparent. In the quiet halls of the Sigmund Freud Museum in London or the preserved apartment on Burgos 19, visitors can still sense the intellectual electricity he left behind. The couch, the books, the artifacts, they are relics of a man who dared to listen where others would look away. A man who believed that through words, spoken freely, without judgment, we might just come to know ourselves. Freud's story, like the mind he explored, has no simple ending. His death closed a life but opened a conversation that continues. To read him is to wrestle with discomfort, complexity, and contradiction. But it is also to be reminded that in the struggle to understand the hidden parts of ourselves, we take part in something profoundly human. His ashes may rest in an urn, but his voice, curious, provocative, searching, still echoes through every therapist's question. Every dream analyzed, every slip of the tongue examined. Freud's presence endures, whispering that the mind, in all its mystery, still has stories to tell. Copyright notice. Ku English channel. All rights reserved. This video and its content are protected by copyright law. Unauthorized copying, redistribution, re-uploading, or modification of this content is strictly prohibited and may result in legal action. Respect the creator. Do not steal. Thanks for learning with Ku English. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time.